Good morning, Dan and Amy. So today's will be an interesting day for the D.C. press corps. We'll see what surreptitious video guerrilla journalist James O'Keefe from Project Veritas was able to obtain from inside sources in network newsrooms. James O'Keefe going on Sean Hannity's radio program yesterday to preview his WikiLeaks-style dump of said video today.
In the next 48 hours, Project Veritas, like WikiLeaks, will be releasing hundreds of hours of tape from within the establishment media. Our next target is, in fact, the media. We are releasing...
How long have you been working on this? How long have you been working on this?
We've had people on the inside come to us, just like Julian Assange had people come to him. We've had people, sources, come to us and give us this information, and we're going to be releasing it WikiLeaks style later this week.
All right.
Ooh, I can't wait.
You'll learn what the D.C. press corps really thinks of you, as if you haven't figured that out yet from some of the comments made, including by Mika Brzezinski on Morning Joe yesterday, where Donald Trump isn't supposed to undermine the media and tell you what to think. She is.
It's like, oh, yeah, you guys are going crazy. He's doing, what are you so surprised about? He's doing exactly what he said he's going to do.
Well, and I think that the dangerous, edges here are that he's trying to undermine the media, trying to make up his own facts. And it could be that while unemployment and the economy worsens, he could have undermined the messaging so much that he can actually control exactly what people think. And that is our job.
That's Mika's job. Okay.
That's our job, not the president's job. We'll control what you think.
For more on this, and I don't know if he'll put a Vulcan mind meld on us, but we're pleased to be joined by former Washington bureau chief at CNN and the author of the new book, Ask More, The Power of Questions to Open Doors, Uncover Solutions, and Spark Change. Emmy award-winning journalist Frank Sesno with a foreword in that book by Wolf Blitzer. Frank Sesno, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad to be with you.
So what do you think about guerrilla journalism, like WikiLeaks, like James O'Keefe, although the two are a little bit different. I don't think O'Keefe is doing any hacking or anything of that sort. And any concern you have about the video content that is scheduled for release later today?
Well, we'll see what it is, and we'll see how he got it, and we'll see what his agenda is. We'll see who he pursues and how. I mean, I have been an advocate for a very long time with all news organizations to open themselves up. I think that the public has a right to know and would actually appreciate knowing how news organizations deliberate, make their decisions, have their debates. And, if cops going to have cameras on their, foreheads every time they make an arrest, I'm not saying that there should be a camera in every newsroom, but it's really... most news organizations should have responsible conversations about what they're covering, how they're covering it, what the trade-offs are. So we'll see what he's got. I think the one thing that I would simply say to those who are just automatic critics of the media, and I just want to say it again, is the word media is plural, very plural.
Yeah.
So lots of places.
Yeah.
So, Frank, when you worked over at CNN, what was it like? Did you feel that they were open-minded and were willing to listen to both sides?
Well, of course, because I was there, what choice did they have?
Yes.
No, but did you have to push the issue every day? I mean...
Listen.
Yeah.
Here's what we had rip-roaring debates about things. We disagreed about how stories should be covered. When I was bureau chief, there were many times when I said to reporters, you're not ready to go on the air with that yet. Who is your source? You remember the old show Get Smart?
Yeah.
Sure.
Remember Maxwell Smart?
Oh,
Well,
sure.
I had a thing when I was bureau chief called the Cone of Silence. And if a reporter came to me with a story that they were going to report with an anonymous source, if I felt that was very sensitive information, we would step into my cone of silence, and they would have to tell me who their source was. We had a whole series of what I thought were reasonable checks and balances so that we could monitor what we went on the air with. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Was there a bias? Yes, there was at times. Did we have to fight against that? Yeah, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It's like you got to ask yourself questions like, what do I know? Why do I know it? Where is it coming from? How can I be so sure?
But did
I
you
love
also
the cone of silence.
did you also have a shoe phone when you were at CNN?
When the cell phones came along, they were about the size of shoes.
Yeah, right. That's
bricks.
very true. But what you're highlighting, though, is one of the issues, right? Personnel is policy. And when you have the D.C. press corps, populated to the distribution of about 90-10 left to right, that necessarily is going to influence the stories you choose in addition to the angles that in which they're covered, by which they're covered.
Probably, but it doesn't have to. I mean, there are ways of training people, just like you have a judge at a trial who may have an opinion about how something happens, but they're going to enforce the rules equally. You hope to both sides. You have a referee who may secretly have a favorite team, but that referee, if they're any good, is going to be fair in how they apply the rules. With the right training, and it's what we try to do and what people should be doing in media, is just say, okay, fine, I see this side of the story from this side. Like, okay, we can do the immigration story 100 times from the families that are going to get ripped away from, the place they came to without documentation. But let's also look at this other side of this community that has been, thrown into crisis because they've been flooded with people who didn't come here with documentation. That's what a good journalist does.
Yeah.
That's what good editors are supposed to do.
I recently did a long interview with Bernie Judge, who was an institution in Chicago for 50 years, all worked at all the newspapers, and we were just talking about what media has become. And he points to, actually, no offense, but in part the rise of the 24-hour cable news network and all the time that you have to fill. Yeah. And so it becomes journalists are part of the story and interject themselves into the story and, frankly, in some cases become the story because you have a panel discussion to talk about a particular issue, and then you have a panel to react to that panel, and then you have two panels removed to react to the panel that reacted to the original story, and you lose some sense of the questions, the diagnostic questions that you highlighted at the start of our conversation, which are the same ones that he highlighted and said, I was never part of the story. And as an editor, I demanded the same sourcing that you're talking about and that my reporters, keep their nose out of their own story in a sense. They're not part of it.
I couldn't agree with you more. When I was bureau chief at CNN, I once sent a memo to my reporters, this is a while ago, that said, here's what I'm noticing when you guys are going live on the air. I'm hearing, I think blah, 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 blah. I think blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, right.
Please avoid the words I think. The public actually doesn't care what you think. You are there to observe, to note, to report. But your interpretation isn't what we're signing on for. Now, that has changed so much. It's partly cable, you're right, and there's a lot we could talk about cable, because cable, I think, has really driven this thing in a lot of different ways. But it's really also about the Internet. And as the Internet came along and people were getting their facts in real time and now as alerts, news organizations, TV, newspapers, all of them became more and more, quote-unquote, interpretive. As they became more interpretive, they became more opinionated. As the audience fractured, they did stuff that was going to pull more clicks and eyeballs in circulation. And so it's been a real problem. In my book, as you point out, I write about different types of questions that we can all use in our lives to real success. Diagnostic questions, what's wrong here? Confrontational questions at the right time, I'm going to hold you accountable. Empathetic questions, let me understand you better. Mission questions, what are we doing together? The problem in the media is we're hovering almost exclusively on confrontational questioning. So we never get to these other things.
Yeah.
And no wonder people are angry and feel that nothing works.
But confrontational questions work, and that's what sells, and that's what everyone... we want to see conflict. We don't want to stop and see the car crash, but everyone slows down anyway. That's what I can compare it to.
Here's what I say to people when I talk to groups. Your kid comes home with a report card. Your kid comes home with 5 A's and 1 D. What do you ask about first?
The D.
Some of this is human nature, right? I mean, maybe you ask about the A's, but I would ask, what went wrong with his class? What happened here?
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me ask you a question about what concerns you more, if there are concerns in either categories. The so-called fake news that's being bandied about, or segmented news, siloed news, where in the digital age you can very easily just consume content that comes from the perspective you share, to the exclusion of having to deal with content that comes from a perspective you don't share?
I think fake news concerns me more, and the whole conversation about fake news, which is also mixed up in and misconstrued. Fake news is not news you don't like. Fake news is not even unfair news, in my view, because that's bad reporting. That's lazy stuff. That somebody should get fired by another newspaper or whatever it is you're buying these days. Fake news, truly fabricated, made up, unaccountable junk from some trolls overseas meant to cause mischief and confuse people. That's really scary. And I saw a presentation just the other week where there's a technology that isn't very far away where you could go in and you could take Donald Trump's words or whoever's words and re-edit them and present a video that looks perfect. That's absolutely not what they ever said.
Wow. That's scary.
Now imagine that's like Photoshop on video steroids, right? How terrible would that be? And people won't know. So the notion of like truly misinforming the public, that's what scares me the most.
So what do you think is the most egregious fake news that you've heard so far?
Well, I would say the most egregious high-profile fake news that I've heard so far is the birther movement around Barack Obama, which is deliberately designed to drive doubts and sow discord and religious difference and all of that kind of stuff, just because it was so prominent. That was just malicious.
I want to ask you a kind of a journalistic ethics question, because we had this discussion when it occurred. The BuzzFeed Trump dossier story. Oh. And then CNN's coverage of it. And Jake Tapper, who I like, I think he's a good journalist, but Jake Tapper tried to make the argument, look, we didn't report the dossier. We didn't post the dossier like BuzzFeed did, knowing that these allegations were uncorroborated. We just reported on the report. And to me, that's a bit of a distinction without a difference when it comes to the ethical decision to report on something that is completely unverified and was conceded to be unverified.
Well, except that it's an interesting thing, and you would have had, and I know they had a rip-roaring debate. I hope it was rip-roaring in the newsroom, because it would be something that you'd really want to pull apart. So let's say you learn that the national security folks, the head of the CIA and the FBI, have briefed both the president and the president-elect on a full big dossier on the Russians. And part of that dossier included a bunch of uncorroborated reports about the president-elect, about these activities that he, about a report that somebody did that's circulating that said bad things. Now, as a journalist, you're going to report that these guys got briefed, and you now have been told something that's that they included in that briefing. I probably would have come down on this. This is basically where CNN came down on that, saying these guys felt so concerned about this thing that they told the president. They told the president-elect. The document was uncorroborated, but it dealt with personal behavior, and leave it at that. Now, there's a lot of room for us to debate that, but that's where I would have come down. What I would not have done was what BuzzFeed did, which was to take an uncorroborated document and just dump it out there and say, well, you have the right to know. I mean, that's where you apply editorial judgment. But this is also where news organizations need to explain to the public why they did it, how they did it, what the arguments were on both sides, so that people can at least know, whether they agree or disagree, that there was a conversation about it.
Well, and it was such a disgusting story, too.
How do you deal with this rise of anonymous source news, particularly when the veracity of the story gets challenged? So we had an example of this over the weekend with Reince Priebus on the Sunday talk show saying the New York Times story suggesting that a number of former Trump campaign aides had regular contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials. Priebus said, I speak with the intelligence community. I spoke with intelligence officers about this. They say the New York Times story was completely overblown and essentially untrue. So how do you deal with that kind of dynamic?
You have to do the most transparency you possibly can, bring the most transparency to the story and explain this to the public. Again, this is really difficult. I've done this when I was a White House correspondent. I had people calling me all the time. When I was the bureau chief, I had people calling me all the time saying, here's something you should know. You should work on this. We need to explain leaks to people. Leaks come from people inside government who are disgruntled, who are patriots, who feel that somebody's about to walk the plank, and they want to tell people. They shoot trial balloons down through leaks, and they loft trial balloons through leaks. I've had secretary, cabinet level people leak stuff because they don't want to have their name associated with it.
Right.
And we have this dance, and good reporters have this dance where you'll push back and argue every time, saying, no, you can't go on background. I need to use your name. I need to use your name, or I won't use the story. But, you know, if somebody says no, it's the only way you can do it. You got to figure out whether the public needs to know and all that kind of stuff. So the way I say it is, you got to. I think it was the Washington Post the other day had a story. Was it the Washington Post or New York Times? You guys might remember, where they cited 9 separate sources, all of whom were anonymous.
Yeah, right.
Well, that's a very good thing. You know, so you're saying to people, we have 9 sources that come from different places. But this is how, you know, this is just how, it's like an anonymous tip that the cops get. You know, this happens all the time. And so I think we have to write the stories differently. I think we have to rate those sources when they're anonymous in some fashion. It would be interesting if you could create some kind of guide for people as to what the agendas were. Are these political opponents that are leaking this? Are these people inside the office that are leaking this? Are they leaking this because they're concerned for their job security? I mean, you can give little cues to people, but anonymous sources are in many ways the mother's milk of a lot of investigative journalism and political journalism, because people don't want their name out there because they fear retribution.
Very interesting discussion. He is Frank Sesno, CNN's former Washington bureau chief, currently the director of George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. And frankly, after our conversation, I have a lot more hope for journalists, at least that you're training at George Washington U. The book is Ask More, The Power of Questions to Open Doors, Uncover Solutions, and Spark Change. Frank Sesno, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. And by the way, if you have a little time, check out, there's an interesting new poll that's out today by Quinnipiac that shows that in the public opinion war between the president and the media, strangely enough, the media has higher marks right now than the president, so go figure.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Frank Sesno. Appreciate it.
See you. Take care.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.